Good afternoon, HIMSS. Thank you, folks. Thank you for coming. So we have come a long way from a healthcare system run by paper and fax machines, or have we? But 6 years after the 21st Century Cures Act was signed into law, we're still a long way from a truly free, secure, and unencumbered exchange of patient information. In today's panel, Ron Burgess, Ravi Dharmavaran, and Levi Bailey, who are gracious enough to join us today, will share their unique perspectives on how far we've come and the importance of technology in the interoperability debate and what role the private and public sectors can continue to play in moving us all along towards a truly interoperable, 8-syllable word, interoperable healthcare system in the United States. I'm Jeff Needham. I am from the Industry Solutions team from MongoDB. For those of you that don't know who MongoDB is, we are what's known as a NoSQL database. We prefer the term document database. And we are very gracious to have you all here in the room with us. And without further ado, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves to you, starting with Ron.
Hi, everybody. Don Burgess, recently retired from the federal government after almost 24 years. In my last posting, I was Deputy CIO for the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, where my boss's boss, as you may know, Admiral Rachel Levine, and prior to that, Admiral Brent Giroir. Stood up TSA and then stood up Homeland Security. I was a CTO of TSA for a brief period of time there, 2010 through 13. So I've been involved with really bringing technology and enabling technology to the government since 2002 to kind of make things run a little bit better. Ravi?
Hi, I'm Ravi. I'm the founder and CEO of Exafluence. I have around 25 years of experience in the data and analytics space. We have built platforms for the healthcare system in the areas of provider data management, care management, population health, as well as payer interoperability. Glad to be on the call today.
Hello, Levi Bailey. I'll be honest, anything after Don's going to be a little underwhelming. I've been with Humana for about 8 years working in the healthcare space. I'm currently Vice President of Enterprise Data and Integration Platforms. I did the early work for enabling interoperability based upon HMS regulations for Humana. And we completed that a couple years back was the initial start. And we're continuing to go on that healthcare journey, really looking at how we can use interoperability to drive value-based care and improve patient outcomes.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. So just for some audience participation, when you hear the term interoperability and you hear that word, especially in healthcare context, what are some words that come to mind? And feel free to just shout some out. And we're all in a safe space here, by the way. What are some terms?
Data exchange at scale.
Data exchange at scale.
Fire APIs.
Fire APIs, sure. Any more? MongoDB? Yes, you're right. Correct. Thank you for saying that. All right. Well, then, without further ado, we'll pose that same question to our panelists. So, gentlemen, we all understand the general concept of interoperability, the free and secure exchange of information. But what does interoperability really mean to each of you, and how has it affected your day-to-day lives, starting with Levi?
Sure. So when I think about interoperability, I think the key to interoperability is it's not just how you communicate, it's what you're communicating. So it's a common language. So you mentioned Fire APIs as an example. I think what makes that the standard for interoperability in healthcare is the fact that we're cementing around a standard set of terminology and language that we can all communicate with that we can leverage in a standard way across the environment and across the ecosystem. That's what makes interoperability unique from typical data point-to-point integrations that we've done forever. That's more of a business transaction across different organizations.
Interoperability standards pretty much define the way the technology can behave with respect to data exchange. One of the things that comes to the mind earlier is the ability of having multiple metadatas, data definitions being different. Without standardizing the format, it becomes much more difficult. Several industries tried with trying to build an ontology, trying to build a map. But again, if it is not regulatively driven, it is difficult to enforce. I think FHIR interoperability and the Cures Act helped us to accelerate that movement, and I think that helped us to define what is the standard of format of exchange, what are the challenges that we face, how we can solve that for executing that.
As a former Fed, I think when I hear interoperability, I think about all the policy issues that we have in our government and how interoperability is dealt with at a tactical level, at a strategic level, and an operational level, right? So, I can't just look at a point solution where we're looking at, open source capability unless I can see how that extends to the larger healthcare ecosystem, right? And I think from time to time, because the problem is so massive, we slip from a 30,000-foot view down to a 5-foot view, and we don't really manage transition properly, right? So I think from a public policy standpoint, when I sat in meetings at the senior level and I hear some of the challenges, my greatest question is, how do we induce cooperation so that the enabling technologies will actually be used? And when you start to decompose that and you start to look at, for the private sector, the profit motives, which is appropriate, it's not a dirty word, that's how our system of government operates. But what induces cooperation to be able to enable interoperability, right? And I think that then becomes the interesting part, because in a profit motive scenario, right, they're competing factors. So one capability or one vendor, one OEM might have an approach versus another. Certainly as a former CTO, I was deluged by the variety of technologies on the market and the change. And maybe I have legacy systems that I'm dealing with, right? How do I now introduce technology into an environment, meet appropriate needs, right? Goals that are objectives, some of them, laid out by Congress, right? And at the same time, not suffer from operational failures that could, grind my organization to fall. So interoperability is a big thing to me. It's not just the technology, it's the people, the processes, and how that technology can be leveraged.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Levi, do you have any comments in response to that from the role of the private insurer?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what Don said, very accurate, and you kind of look at how government rolls policy out, and oftentimes they target the payers because there's like 4 of us or 5 major payers. So it's a little easier to put regulations against the payer. But the reality is, to Don's point, that's only going to have limited impact to the ecosystem, because the reality is that I think the most critical place where interoperability can change healthcare is at the clinical level, and you have to have some incentive to do that. In the sense that, for years, EHRs, their method, the way they've monetized is by controlling the data. Like, if I have it in my system and I can get other hospitals to sign up with my thing, then you get access to it, and it's this nice, integrated experience. That's a profit motive. So trying to then break that apart and create interoperability for the ecosystem, as opposed to just look at it at the individual company level, that's a little harder thing to do. And as long as we're only targeting or applying policy at the payer level, I think that's where you're going to have limited success, because you still have to deal with the other participants, the providers, the caregivers, that area. Humana has a very unique structure there in the sense that we're using interoperability for our benefit, in the sense that we're also going and kind of working in the provider space. We've stood up clinical solutions with our CenterWell brand, and that's to drive that more holistic experience and allow interoperability to kind of have an impact in value-based care.
All right, thank you, Levi. Don, you mentioned policy and inducing collaboration and cooperation. Levi, your comments on the perspective of the private insurer. For all 3 of you gentlemen, in terms of technology, specifically, do you feel that we're too heavy on policy and not heavy enough on the technology perspective? And then specifically, do you think the role of data and databases is being overlooked as possibly a primary driver for interoperability?
Ravi wanted to start us out. Ravi's our coach, by the way, so just want to.
From the standpoint of technology being, I think technology is a enabler in most of the scenarios. From a standpoint of interoperability, be able to work with, for example, the HL7 standards were there way from before, and the standards evolved to be defined for an exchange format is one thing that organizations are adapting to, but again, it has to work with the existing current state architectures, which may be a legacy mainframe system or legacy systems that has to talk to each other. And if you look at a typical healthcare system, there are multiple type of databases and file structures that they have to do the exchange and interoperability with. For example, the CCDA file formats or XML formats or EDI interfaces and all. When FHIR is defined as a model for data exchange, it is also important to have those mechanisms in place to convert the existing data sources to be converted into one standardized format. Once that happens, even then mapping it to the FHIR resource type and trying to manage the metadata also becomes another critical aspect. So there are technology components that needs to drive the implementation or execution strategy, but to Dan's and Levy's point, it's also people, culture, more provider participation. For example, right, we saw more participation on revenue cycle streams with providers, but there needs to be an evinced interest not only on revenue cycle streams to enable digital health for a patient, what you can do proactively to increase the digital experience. So a lot of things come into play.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ravi.
Yeah, going back to my oversimplification of looking at things at a 5-foot level, vice at 30,000-foot level, right? So, the CARES Act during 2016 and the Obama administration was to deal with some of the challenges we have in the U.S. American healthcare systems, right? And, getting people insured, getting better information. We're still feeling, a lot of us, and the 5-foot level is our experience when we go to our caregiver's office, right? Everyone here probably has that, right? And how many of us go and fill out a piece of paper multiple times, and if you go to a big hospital system, you go from one department to another, they're asking you the same questions. And all of our IT practitioners go, why are we doing this, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? But I think the opportunity space there is to think of it at that level, right? And then think about the policy level and look at what's in between. Levi, from a Humana perspective, right? What he said was, we innovated because it made us operate more efficiently. And I think you look for the opportunity space between that and how you give better care to your patients, right? So now I'm seeing healthcare providers using iPads, and they're starting to be a little bit more efficient, moving away from the paper, and that's good. The problem now is that we're creating these little data enclaves, if you will, right? That may or may not necessarily talk to the payer systems or some of the other systems. We see that every day. I mean, we live in a capitalist society and there are always companies trying to bring something there, but is that an island? And the trick now is if we can start to amalgamate the data and make it more efficient to use. I think JSON as a platform is a fantastic enabler to allow for that. Then you're going to see the change. But now we need to educate the people at the tactical level to start to do that. In fact, I think we were talking about this earlier, is how do we induce some younger version of yourself to understand the technology, to speak to the people that they report to say, hey, I think I have a problem-solving solution for this. I just need to be able to get a hold of this technology and make it happen. Get them to understand the business problem or the operational problems, and at the same time enable them to do their jobs, and then it may trigger a change. But looking for what is in the best interest of the organization providing either the care or the technology, seeing what's going to help them, because businesses need to run efficiently, and at the same time trying to enhance the value of care for parents. But we're all patients, aren't we? So look at it from your standpoint. What's your experience at your doctor's office? Talk to your doctor. Because if you get them thinking that we need to line up and move in a particular direction, we're probably going to have a higher likelihood of changing that mindset that we have in this country at this time.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would say, I think we have the technology, to be frank. I think for the most part, like you said, we have we tackle other problems of mass data sharing, data integration in different industries. I think the people and process side of it is where we have to continue to push the boundaries, because it's really about getting, and I think it goes back to what is the value proposition to each individual or each organization within the stack. In the end, we do live in a capitalistic society, so it has to make sense. If we don't figure out how each person benefits or each organization benefits, you're going to see limited adoption of anything, because there's a cost associated with it. And yes, the technology's there, you can adopt the technology. It's not simple though. I mean, let's say the insurance industry, relatively low margins. We've invested a lot in technology over the years, and we still run a lot of things on mainframe. I mean, it's just, that's where a lot of our data is sourced, because there's no value proposition to go and modernize that necessarily.
Yeah.
It's expensive, and you can't justify it. You can't make the money back. So you have to figure out, how do I support that while not investing billions of dollars to modernize something that's not going to get me much in the end. And we've tackled that problem to some extent in the way that we've approached interoperability in our case, which is, exposing the data through those optimized data stores like a Mongo or something else. And so you can tackle it with that technology, but again, you're asking people to do it, and they have to have a reason to do it.
It's a great point. So I want to come back to that, Levi, because we know you've had some success in that space, particularly around FHIR and interoperability. But to Don's point, did what Don said resonate with folks in the audience, that we're creating these data enclaves? But show of hands, who here feels in their own organization that we're simply just creating more data and creating more things now to manage, and the end goal of streamlining is actually making things harder for us on the IT side? Is that fair? Anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to add to that? No? Any particular pain points? Well, Levi has done a fairly good job inside Humana, in my opinion, in modernizing, specifically around interoperability. FHIR was a driver, would you say, Levi?
Well, honestly, policy was the driver, right? The reality is that insurers were required, I don't know, was it been 3 years, 4 years, 5 years ago? I don't even know. It's been some time to expose data. It was at the same time Don was talking about, to expose data as FHIR. There were certain resources that were mandated within that regulation. Now, I think you saw each payer approach the problem differently. Some did it the bare minimum. Okay, what is the minimum requirement there to maintain what I'm required to do by policy? And other insurers said, okay, well, how can we maximize that opportunity? It's kind of interesting what we've seen is, and going back to the value proposition of data, the most consumed resources that we've exposed via FHIR have been things that are more competitive in nature, in the sense that it's like provider networks, payment terms, or policy information. And it's really been consumed by other payers. Like, that's where you've seen the other payers consuming those FHIR resources from the other payers to try to use it, which I think was part of the point. Let's be honest, the policy was driven towards price transparency and being able to try to drive costs down. But again, the margins are extremely high on the insurance side of the house. And so the reality is, until we get interoperability at the care level and change the facilitation of care and streamline it so that we're ending up in a better spot at the patient level, I don't think it'll have the end effect that we hope it does, as far as getting our prices down and cost of healthcare down.
Go ahead, Ravi.
I kind of echo with what Levi said, but I see another dimension to it. One is, from a regulatory standpoint, the push is the one that drove the initial adaptation. But I am seeing emerging health tech companies wanting to have the devices data come in and able to talk to EMRs directly. I think there is certain segment of technology companies that want to super innovate and then want to be able to enhance the patient experience. They are being the early adapters of FHIR, in my opinion. and certain organizations that are in the TPA business that are short of having less margins but want to somehow increase the margins by enhancing the profitability are seeing the value of FHIR implementations in some form. But having said that, to enable that to standardize the industry, like I said, multiple industries like EDM Council in investment data, Accord in insurance, all of that have tried to standardize. Unless there is a push and an ROI that gets into the benefit that the industry sees, and especially if it's on low margins. A typical payer is working on a low margin, a TPA is working on a low margin, and somebody else is working on a low margin. That digital transformation initiative will not be delivering the ROI unless there is a patient benefit that entails at the end.
Right, so sort of a yes or no, but please expound on it. Has the CMS regulation, has the push to FHIR protocols as the data standard for patient interoperability and exchange, has that had a net positive effect towards interoperability?
I think so. I think it's the first step on a journey of 1,000 miles. I think we still have a long way to go, but we just need to keep understanding. I can give you the perspective as a former Fed in two different industry, healthcare and aviation, and what I can tell you is that government folks that inherit policy direction from the executive office or from Congress, generally we don't want to beat up on business or industry, right? We are always looking for a way to work with industry. So we're not oblivious to the fact of profit motives or competing profit motives and those kinds of things. That's fine. I think, though, what we tried to do is to look out for the citizen, right? I mean, that's why we're there. Your safety, your health, and everything else. And I don't know that we do a good enough job, especially over the last 10 and 15 years, really moving out on that message the way we used to. I think we're a little, reticent about coming out and dealing because there's somebody or something that rises up. Hey, you guys are trying to have control. But the truth of the matter is, I think government plays a very important role in setting the policy and structure and framework by which we can approach this. And for those of you guys that have run, multi-million-dollar projects and everything else, the first thing you got to do is document pain points, objectives, and try to understand and decompose the problem into bite-sized chunks, right? And the value of that project is to determine how well you did in answering the mail, right? And I think that the policy that's out there right now and the subsequent, and Levi and I were talking about this, there's a couple of things going on in our healthcare system that's probably different from some of the first world healthcare systems in other countries, right? On the one side, besides our inefficient healthcare system, and it is inefficient, and some people, believe it or not, like it that way, right? Because there's money to be made in an inefficient system. But it's inefficient and there's ample opportunity to optimize. But at the other side, we, as the American people, our health situation is markedly different from some of the other first world countries. So we're not as healthy as some other countries. And some of the health issues that we're dealing with is somewhat unique to America. In a lot of cases, we eat the right food, so on and so forth. And certainly the Surgeon General has been a big proponent of some of this in past years. So having said that, I think at least when we come back to data and data interoperability and those kinds of things, is to kind of find out what incentivizes the players in this ecosystem. What's in it? If you can't speak to them and help them understand what's in it for them, then maybe they won't make the investment that Humana made to optimize and to do that, because that's the only way we make the change, because government can't do it. It really is industry that, and most of good government people, we know that industry innovates, not the government. Our job is to ensure that the policies, the programs, and the initiatives are there, and where we can, certainly HHS gives out grants and funds a lot of programs to induce cooperation in industry so that we can make it better, right? So data and all the advances in technologies that we've made thus far, it's there. To these guys' point, the technology is already there. We're not exploiting the technology for the outcome that we need for the American people.
And thank you, Don. Robbie?
I echo with what Don and Levi are saying. One part of it where I feel that there is a lot of convergence and more is that with hyperscalers like the cloud providers coming into play, and also very technology players being into the mechanism of doing, I think there needs to be an integrated solution that would fit for the future state architectures, but I also have a plan on how to move from current state architecture to future state architectures. So technology is already there, but the nuances of implementing are still there. There is a kind of the ability to harmonize data, the ability to map data, the ability to bring analytics out of it, the ability to say that I'm solving a problem, where is the data quality, is it upstream or downstream, all of that are still relevant. So no matter how much there needs to be a concerted effort to bring quite a bit of accelerators to get the interoperability to be easily implemented.
Yeah, I think the question you asked was around, did the policy have a desired effect? And
Right.
I think the simple answer is it got the ball rolling. So yes, it did. It obviously did, because it required some adoption of a standard that had been in the works for a number of years, but had limited adoption, right? But it definitely increased that. And really moved us away from just HL7 to something that's more near real time, or something that you can directly interact with, which is a step in the right direction if you're going to influence care. What I would say, going back to what Robbie says, it's not an easy thing to do. The technology's there, but there's still a lot of hurdles that we have to get past. I mean, one of the big ones that comes to mind for me is the ability, yes, we have a standard around HL7, or around fire in this case, but we still are trying to put together, okay, how do we share data across entities? What's the legality there? How data protection, getting the proper consent, how does that work, or what is allowed and what's not allowed? I think that's something in the industry we're still trying to take these technologies, figuring out how to apply them in a way that it will allow us to take advantage of them to their full extent and still meet what is required by us by law, and especially in the public healthcare space. And when I say that, I'm saying, Medicare, Medicaid space, every state, every government writes their own rules around that. And so figuring out how it applies, can be very difficult for a company to fully adopt.
So I'm going to ask you to answer another question, Levi. In your opinion, who is likely to play a bigger role in pushing interoperability forward in the next 5 to 10 years? Healthcare players, established healthcare players in the private sector, or the public sector, or perhaps some of the newer entrants into the healthcare space, such as Walmart, Google, CVS, I know one of your competitors, Apple, Amazon?
Can I cop out and say I think it's going to be the people that are going to drive it? Meaning each patient, like if we demand something of, again, industry is driven by the consumer. If the consumer demands certain experiences, certain integrations, certain expectations to how their care is facilitated, that will drive companies to then make those adoptions and make those changes. I don't think there's just going to be one big player or one company that's going to drive that, because again, it has limited scope. We can't do it alone. Like the payer can't go and do all this stuff, but if the provider systems don't adopt it or don't take advantage of Smart on Fire, and if you don't have each individual local provider adopting those technologies that support that, it's not going to move forward. But if the patient, through their ability to choose who they go to and how their care is facilitated, demands it, you'll see more companies rise to the top that go and offer that experience.
Patient demand, sure. Don?
Data and information is power, right? And so there's competitive value to some data. What I can tell you is, without going into detail, we know of healthcare providers that hoard data or do not want to share data because it offers up a competitive advantage to another, healthcare provider, right? And therein, I think, is the challenge. I think so. The opportunity space maybe is some policy that can break down those barriers. I think the concern then becomes on the person sharing their data is misuse of the data. And I have to agree that, and Levi brought this up, what are the legal ramifications of sharing the data or incomplete data? I think from a healthcare standpoint, that's a challenging piece. You're aggregating data from different providers and different sources. What happens if a critical piece of data, a allergic reaction to a particular, novel drug got missed, and the patient has an adverse reaction to that? So it's, I don't want to make it seem so easy, I think, but there's some real world implications that I don't think we've completely, even if we can get everybody to play well together in a sandbox, I think there's some inherent operational challenges that we'd probably have to overcome at some point in time.
Ravi, from your perspective, as a software vendor.
As I feel that there is a larger need for technology people to collaborate. At the same time, there is a larger need also for organizations to have an easier way of giving consent, creating the trust factor, and also enabling and creating the enabling solutions that helps in implementing the FHIR solutions. For example, right, the federal organizations in CMS and all have created their own public profile, and other organizations are working towards that to create the profiles that mean as a mechanism for data exchange. In provider space and in payer space, I think there is a large initiatives to do this for care gaps initiatives and also for running around programs that can help the quality of care. But having said that, at the end of the day, it has to be a larger initiative from all the industries and policies driving it to get the adaptation. I think policy will be centrally the driver, and the technology companies have to come together, especially the hyperscalers and all, to create that much more easily executable kind of a thing.
Has the regulation gone far enough?
Well, it's, again, how far do you go down with the regulation, right, where it becomes a problem? I know of a healthcare provider that had recently done some mergers and acquisitions and acquired some other healthcare providers, which is natural, but they were struggling internally, right, to get their data and into 4 or 5 systems that they needed to operate, right? And I saw how much struggle they had, and it really kind of gave me a better sense of how costly it is when you're inheriting, mainframes and everything else. The cost of change, certainly for me, if I wanted to adopt a new technology or modernize my legacy systems, there's a cost to change. And it's not only, what are the operational impacts that I'm going to have? Am I going to have downtime? What goes bump in the night? And what kind of public outcry are we going to have from that, right? Certainly, then, federal budgets have been just deluged in the last few years, probably the last 15 years, since 2010 actually. And so there's not enough money there. So now you got to find the enabling technology that also has a cost advantage to it. Because you got to figure out, I've got to find out is if the O&M cost for this legacy system is more than this new system, well, am I going to see a return? And I would have to justify that to OMB, right, in order to move forward on that. So that's how challenging. I imagine in the private sector, Levi and his team have to look at that as well. What's the cost of change to really adopt some of the new shiny objects that's out there?
That's a pretty powerful statement, Don. Does that resonate? How many folks, out of curiosity, in the room work for organizations that run on mainframe technology? Just by a show of hands. fair amount, right? Does that worry you? Does it worry your management? Maybe, right? Levi, you have some thoughts on that. I know in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously, it worries you. It's definitely something that we've looked at and game planned around how we can modernize that, but the cost is significant. I mean, it's not cheap, and oftentimes, you got 25 to 50 years worth of IP built into that. It's a monumental task to then go and unwind it and make sure that you still offer the same benefits when you move to a modern solution, especially if you're going to try to buy a vended one. I want to go back to, the question though, when you said, has the policy gone far enough? I almost would like to reverse that and said maybe there's an opportunity to look at where we can remove certain policies to incentivize the adoption of it. Like, what are the barriers in policy outside of, hey, go adopt FHIR as a payer, but maybe around how data can be leveraged within the healthcare system across the provider healthcare and payer space to make it to create more advantage to adopting the technologies and the solutions. Sometimes I think we tend to put policy in place and add another rule to try to drive something, but maybe sometimes those rules are actually an inhibitor overall to the ability to innovate and move forward. So I think that's a thing that we as a government, as a people, need to look at and say, okay, what are the mechanisms by which we can encourage or incentivize by allowing people to take advantage of those things without trying to enforce it in another way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. By the way, how was it, give us a sense of what it was like selling the idea of modernizing in your organization. That's not an easy task, right?
Are there scars
Well,
underneath the shirt?
So we got
That's
some
right.
other Humana folks here who have been down this path. And, the funny thing is on the IT side, I think everybody knows you need to modernize. We know how painful it is to keep the system up at night, right? And if you don't modernize it, it's just adding risk. The challenge is, you have a limited budget to work with, and the business always has these things that they're trying to go do. And telling them, well, I'm not going to give you anything new. What I'm going to do is take this old thing and I'm going to make it new, but you're still getting the same thing. That is where the challenge is, because that's a big ask, right? You're going to have to pause on some things when we do this, but this will allow you to do more stuff in the future that you can't do today. Getting that message right is a very challenging and painful thing to do on the IT side. But we have had some success with it. We have made progress. You can never make it fast enough, though.
Yeah, some lessons in hindsight, Levi? Some things that you did well, some things that you wish you didn't do, maybe, and didn't do so well.
I think where we have grown in the last year, that is, I feel is a prime opportunity for us to do better than we did in the past, was how do you bring the story forward to show the value proposition to the investment? I think sometimes creating that entire, especially as technologists, we can talk about the technical benefits, but those don't talk the business speak around what are the financial benefits or what are the long-term operational or cost benefits. And I think starting to put a more cohesive plan together that can take it to that level is something that we've gotten better at, that we probably didn't do as well initially. We were too focused on the technology and not enough on, okay, well, how does this work for business, and tying that together. It was there, we knew it was there, we just didn't spend the time to create that story in a persuasive way. And it was kind of just saying, hey, you all need to be digital, so modernize, telling the business that. I think it's on us as technologists to show them why digital is better for their business. And that's where we've kind of pivoted to partner a little bit better and get them engaged in it, and then explain to them how they can take advantage of a digital footprint within their business.
That's a great answer, Levi. The D word, someday we'll probably stop using that word digital, but for the next few years at least, for the foreseeable future, that's in our vernacular, right? The other word, the C word, cloud. How has cloud impacted the interoperability in your experiences and in your work? And I'll pass that one to Robbie actually first.
Cloud, the ability of an organization moving towards cloud just to is very vital to their digital strategy in every organization. And as such, right, I think the hyperscalers like AWS, Google, and all bringing the FHIR interoperability to platform to be easily done. One of the things when you are onboarding a cloud vendor, the policies around the security, the policies around the privacy is the part of it, the provisioning of the data and all takes a vast consideration for a CISO organization to approve. On top of it, healthcare data has to comply with audits of ITrust, HIPAA and all others. It becomes a humongous task. And in that case, a cloud provider, massive hyperscalers and the likes of MongoDB and all, which have gone through that CSA agreements, HIPAA agreements and in place, will only help in implementing the solution faster. But again, all organizations have hybrid cloud environments, so the ability to talk between the departments and the ability to make it much more easily feasible as a solution is the thing that has to be on Works.
Yeah.
Certainly, cloud is a fantastic IT capability that, we in the early days of cloud implementation. I got involved with implementing cloud in the federal space back in 2010, and there was a lot of concern around data portability. I remember we had a conjoined project with the CIA to see if we could move data from Amazon, from AWS over to Google and Microsoft. And it worked well. There was a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of concern. And for the most part, certainly as far back as 2009, if I remember correctly, the government had a cloud initiative, right? Cloud First initiative. And it was painful, but we did it. But, when we in Homeland Security had one of our data centers go down, let me tell you, those of the 22 agencies that had data in the cloud was really appreciating it, right? Because even though there was replication between data center 1 and 2, the ability for have replication out on the West Coast to deal with latency issues and those kinds of things has been fantastic, right? So I think cloud is there. I think, it's not going to go anywhere, although from time to time I hear people wanting to take back. There's always knee-jerk reactions and pendulum swings, but take back their data and have their own data center. And still yet, we're never going back to the old ways. We're never going back to here. So you're going to have hybrid cloud scenarios. I think it does make sense from time to time if you have truly sensitive data that it's not being consumed, right, in a large fashion. It may make sense to have, on-prem data centers to be able to have better control of it. But I think it's here to stay, and it's a great enabling technology.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. Levi?
Yeah, everything that's said in the sense that I think cloud computing holds a lot of promise, and to be frank, I don't know that you can truly meet a digital demand. If we're talking digital, right, the idea that you're upping the scale of integrations in a data center environment very easily without significant investments, especially if you want reliability, high availability, all of those things. To Don's point, saying people are bringing stuff back in, I think it's more of that knee-jerk reaction to, it's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to use cloud computing. It's another thing to do it right. If you don't do it right and you just go off and say, hey, I've got this thing in my data center, I'm going to throw it out in the cloud and magically this is all going to be great, you're going to spend a lot of money and you're probably going to look at it and say that was a bad idea. And it's because you didn't actually think about how cloud computing is designed to be efficient. You have to really, your entire team has to change around how you adopt cloud services, how you manage those cloud services, what are the operations around it, because you're no longer buying a fixed capacity up front and I'm done, I've made my purchase, I know what it is, I'm just running on it. If I can't serve it, I can't serve it. You can serve as much as you want, you can consume as much as you want. So now you have to be a little bit more, have a little more governance around how you consume those resources, how you manage those resources, and how you manage to your budget to allow yourself to be operationally efficient with it so that it doesn't come back and you're like, oh, that was a mistake. Because if you do it right, you can be very efficient with it, but you have to take the time to rethink the way that you're leveraging just compute and storage and cloud services in general versus how you treat and build things in a data center mentality or a data center solution.
I want to go back to something that Levi said, and I think is very, very important. he mentioned kind of relaxing some of the regulatory demands that are being placed in the healthcare piece. I think one of something that is an opportunity space for some of the big players in the market, whether it's Amazon or Google or anybody who wants to jump into this, is as best as they can, see what they can do to kind of deal with that middle layer, the people processing technology, and create a representative model that might be used to go back to the policymaker who says, look, if we did this open source, fully integrated, interoperable model and expanded by scale to the full American healthcare system, would you make some policy changes to do that? Actually prove to the government that can happen, because up until today, I really didn't think of the burden, right, that guys like Levi's having to deal with the we talk about policy, right? But a camel is a horse designed by a committee, right? So, wouldn't it be great to have some bottom-ups up and really look at what the value of care would be at that point, right?
That's a great point, Don. So a pilot, it starts small.
Yeah, great analogy.
Yeah.
Great analogy indeed. So a pilot, you're suggesting basically build something small,
Right.
keep the committee out, prove it, and then showcase that and sell it.
Yeah.
Does that sound, to Robbie, as from a software vendor, do you see that?
Yes, I go with the whole process of hyperscalers able to contribute both from a technology front, probably with this idea seems to be a lot to think about, because if they can prove to a population that there is an ROI on the benefits on it, probably the public-private ecosystem can, even though with less margins, can look into it. The second thing that I feel is also important, I missed to say, is that FHIR interoperability is enforced in the US, but in other markets, some of the things like OpenEHR and other clinical standards are also coming into play. I kind of feel that there is a thinking at least in the Europe and other markets, that clinical data is much more handled by other standards like OpenEHR. I kind of feel that FHIR also requires a continuous improvement of getting that requirements being completely documented, and so that it's meeting not only from a patient care ecosystem but also from a clinical ecosystem.
Right, so almost an agile, learn fast mode.
Yes.
So to Levi, a pilot, did you follow a similar methodology or a similar approach for enacting change inside the IT systems in Humana?
Yeah, I mean, we went down a path of recognizing that we weren't going to modernize all our systems day one in order to support these types of interactions. And so we kind of put together a general principle of an architecture along with EA, and then built out the initial pilot and build using interoperability as a driver. And then since then we've had other larger adoption for other initiatives using the same kind of framework across our organization. So I definitely think that's generally the way you have to prove these things out. Humana in the past, we're kind of learning actually, in fact you're going to probably see more of this from us, is how do you manage your investments effectively? Anytime you go and say, hey, here's this big thing that we're going to do and it's going to be great, and you go invest $10 million in it, well, you have to wait till the end of it to determine whether that $10 million was worth what you invested in it. So tying closer to use cases and pilots and something that you can drive and get attribute value early on is what I think you're seeing more and more companies do, especially, I mean, just look at where we're at as a financial ecosystem right now. Like, companies are losing money, their people are being let go, they're talking recession half the time. Companies have to be very fiscally responsible with their capital. And so getting to value quicker and making sure that whatever investment you're making is delivering, that's an important thing. So
Yeah, thank you, Levi. So we have 10 minutes left. We'll do 2 minutes for each of you gentlemen, and then we'll take questions. So 2 minutes of what kind of advice would you give to younger versions of yourselves who are out there right now tackling the interoperability challenge with technology?
At every layer in the organization and every era in your professional life, your job is to understand the problem and find a way to offer up a problem-solving solution. I think, as you rise to the executive level in technology management, I would encourage you to, when you get to Levi's level or my level, right, and you're within a larger organization and you have large budgets and people are depending, it's your ability to evangelize and convince a whole lot of people that moving in this direction is going to benefit the organization and the people that the organization serve. So what I would suggest to you is technology is ever changing. The evolution of technology just continues over and over. I can't even keep up anymore. In fact, I rely on really, really smart people that work for me to help me understand what the technology can do. And then I have to place enough trust in them to deliver on that, right? Because then I have to go and sell that to a bunch of people that, are basically pounding their fists on the table and said, this better work, right? And so understand that and understand your place in that, that ecosystem and promote that and know what it is. But stay away from, shiny objects for the sake of shiny objects. Look for things that have true value and can deliver that.
Great.
I believe that more and more use cases for how interoperability can solve a problem are emerging. We started first with just exchange of data. Now we are seeing how we can help for care gaps. Now we are seeing about how we can help doctors with their scheduling and proactively looking at their suspect and prospective conditions. So we are seeing several use cases coming up. I think the ability to solve a problem should be the driver for leveraging FHIR or technology as an enabler. I kind of feel that the more and more we stick onto it, we'll see much more adoption.
Great. Levi?
I would align to what was just said. The reality is you have to know your problem. You have to be solving a problem. And I think that's something to cement around first before you go and develop the solution. Figure out what your problem is and where you can have value. So, and even in interoperability, I mean, obviously, one of the problems we had was you have policy that dictates you have to do this as a payer, and if you don't, you're going to get fined or whatever else. That's one driving factor. But I think for a business to really take advantage of it is to get beyond the, hey, I have to go do this, to the, how can I take advantage of this? There's a story I heard years ago around the FDA, right before it existed. The Heinz Corporation really lobbied to get the FDA put in because they thought regulation was better. But they didn't look at it as something they had to do. They actually looked at it as an accelerator to their ability to take advantage of that and use that to grow their business. And so I think a lot of times that's what's key, is to understand how you can use that thing and drive value from it as opposed to just getting the thing done.
Oh, great. That was great. Thank you, Levi. Well, thank you, three gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, Don Burgess, Ravi Dharmavaram, and Levi Bailey, thank you so much. Let's give these gentlemen a round of applause.